Recording. So, welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is focused on the risks, reality, and responses to website accessibility. Our focus for today's conversation is really going to be about the implications for those of you who are either based in California or serving Californians from wherever you are in the US or around the world. The web accessibility regulations and enforcement can apply to you, and we'll have a little bit more of a discussion about that today. So I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Sapir Yarden. I am the community and brand lead here at accessiBe. I am involved in a lot of different things, but one of them is having these conversations with Kelley about how regulation is impacting our customers and the community. So I'm really excited for the conversation today and for you to get to know our guest speaker. So Kelley, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, and good afternoon, everyone on the West Coast and anywhere you're coming in from. Today's going to be a great time to really share in a short amount of time a lot of good information to carry back with you in whatever sector you're serving. My name is Kelley Simoneaux. I was paralyzed when I was 16 years old in a car wreck, became a paraplegic, a wheelchair user, and for many years now have been navigating the world and through the lens of accessibility, really based on my own need to have the space around me to be accessible. I'm also the founder of a law firm that helps individuals after catastrophic events and more broadly in the disability space. And so that is the lens I'm going to bring with you today, a little background as a lived experience as well as my legal insight. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Kelley. What a great introduction. So, for today's conversation, we are going to cover where the risks really originate. Then we'll go into how these lawsuits actually happen, where the regulations impact you or where they might meet you in your business journey and your accessibility journey, some of the gaps that you may or may not be aware of, and next steps for you to move forward. So, Kelley, I'll start with you on this. Where do accessibility risks really originate?
Well, I mean, and really, like when I talk to people about this, I'm looking at it as a business owner myself. I'm evaluating those risks, and at the end of the day, the way that most people are getting information and getting access to businesses is through their websites, is through the digital space, and so when websites are that customer facing system for all of us, it lends itself to a place where it needs to be open to everyone. And I think, accessiBe's put these stats out, but I think only like 2 or 3% of the internet as it exists today is accessible. And that's an abysmal statistic, because really when we don't have accessibility in the digital space, that gap is really a barrier for someone to access, buying a pair of shoes or logging onto their bank or whatever the day-to-day needs are. And when those barriers exist, it creates a very natural legal and barrier, exposure, as well as operational exposure. You're not going to get the benefit of that sale, and you're also opening yourself up to a legal risk, because at this point, it has been known websites have to be accessible, just like if you have a storefront, the brick and mortar.
You bring up so many good points. The first one I want to address is sort of like, if accessibility were a coin, then on the one side you have the brand trust, the brand perception, and the reputation of your business. And on the other side of that, you have the legal and compliance risks of not doing the right thing. So they feed into each other, but they're two different sides of the same topic. And then you also mentioned, and this is actually ironic that you mentioned it just now, because it was just about a week ago that the Web AIM business has released information about the number of websites that are accessible. They do an annual scan of the top 1 million websites. When I started at accessiBe, which was nearly 5 years ago, it was around 2 to 3%. We have made it a whole whopping 2 more percentage points forward. So we're at around 5% accessibility right now. But what we're also finding is the number of accessibility errors per page has gone up as more people are using vibe coding to create websites. So it's this really interesting dynamic where if you're not building with accessibility awareness, if you're not thinking about all of your end users and all of your potential customers to begin with, you're bound to repeat the same issues. So maybe as a whole, we are making progress, but on a page by page basis, that isn't really helping. And where that comes in is, okay, like you said, customers facing specific barriers to their user journey. If I want to complete a purchase, or if I want to leave my information somewhere, or if I want to download resources, but I can't do that, those are all barriers to me being part of an equal society where I can access that information. So, just some really interesting points back to what you said. Thank you for sharing. Okay. So for those of you who are on the call today, we have this quick self-check. We haven't done this before, but I do want to open it up for you to consider. When you're thinking about accessibility for your organization, for your website, and this can depend also, it doesn't necessarily need to depend on how big or small your business is, but do you know who owns accessibility at your organization? Is this something that you're going to have to take ownership of, or is this something that you have multiple teams take on their equal parts in this effort? Next question. Are legal, product, and marketing aligned on your accessibility goals? Meaning the scope of accessibility can change depending on whether you're the legal person thinking about the regulation and compliance aspects versus the usability of a tool. Third question. When was your last audit? Do you know the last time that you've actually audited or reviewed specific flows on your website? That can be a huge part of just uncovering some of the barriers that exist that maybe have been barriers that have yielded some negative or maybe even positive, but have yielded results for your website, but you didn't know that they were accessibility issues. Fourth question. Have you tested those journeys yourself? That can also be a really telling moment. And then our final question for you is, if an accessibility issue is reported today, who's the person that responds to that? So I think you see the theme here in these questions of taking accountability and knowing what part of the project or part of the implementation really applies to you. And that's something that we hope you carry forward with you as we move forward in the conversation. Kelley, do you have any thoughts about this sort of quick self-check?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a practical standpoint, and what I'm seeing is oftentimes business find out about accessibility issues when they have to engage a lawyer, or when another a legal issue comes to the surface, not really when they're executing an audit. And so making sure that there can be that process in place where an audit is done on a basis that allows issues to come forward. And it's not that this is something where a person is becoming aware about their business and the lack of accessibility because someone in the legal field is bringing that to their attention.
Such a good point. So let's move forward with the conversation. And can you tell us a little bit about why California specifically increases exposure? I mean, I know from my experience that California consistently falls in the top 3 states for ADA lawsuits, but I'd love to know a little bit more about why specifically California.
Yeah, I mean, we can break this down a little bit. Let's go back to the Americans with Disabilities Act. That was a piece of legislation that was, that was put into place in 1990. It was at that time the digital space did not look in any way, shape, or form as it does today. And so it was not specifically contemplated. However, the Department of Justice and other cases that have come forward make it very clear that under Title III, under the public accommodations, that the digital space must be accessible. So you have this piece of federal legislation that really captured so many aspects of accessibility, and is applicable to every single state. Then we look at, California. California has a couple of things going for it that makes it worth noting, which is why really we're bringing California to the forefront of this webinar. One is that the number of cases you see filed, and that's because of the state-specific regulations they have. California has kind of, an additional icing on the ADA cake, which is the UNRRA Act. The UNRRA Act is a piece of civil rights legislation that was codified in California, which not only bolsters what the ADA says about accessibility, but puts monetary damages for each act of that's found, like each act of inaccessibility that's found. So in that case, it lends itself to, does that mean each person that finds themselves in an inaccessible space on your website, is that going to be a 4,000? It's $4,000 for each act, and so is that going to continue to calculate? Like those numbers could really add up, and that is why California has a very strong system in place to protect these civil disability rights. And to note, like, you don't have to be a business that's registered in California or has a store located in California. If your business has exposure, is reaching clients or potentially reaching people in California, that could be enough. And then finally, the CCPA and the CPRA, that's the California Consumer Privacy Act and the California Privacy Rights Act. These, again, are state-specific pieces of legislation that create an additional level of protection for consumers, which means it can add an additional layer of exposure to businesses.
Yes, definitely. I want to add a few more points to what you were just saying. So, on the CCPA and CPRA, and in general on privacy, in the past, cybersecurity was not thought to be such an important aspect. It was a nice to have as well. And it has slowly become an incredibly important part of infrastructure for all websites and for all businesses, to the point where now when you go on a website, you'll probably have some cookie requirements, you'll have a CAPTCHA, you'll find the privacy policy of any business. If you want to do business with another organization, you might want to review their privacy policy as well. So that's all existing already in California, which means that if someone has an inaccessibility issue with part of your privacy infrastructure on your website, that can constitute an accessibility barrier to them. But also, that is a trajectory that we're going to see with accessibility, that it is nice to have, it has been seen or viewed by businesses as a nice to have, but we are definitely gearing away from that, especially with the number of regulations that are coming up, especially with how web experiences are becoming more dynamic and more complex. And anyone can build a website these days, but not everyone can do it with accessibility in mind. And that's really what we want to bring to you today. And I know that there's also a variety of different guests on our webinar today. Some of you might be coming from the more consumer side of businesses, whether you're working in retail or e-commerce, and some of you might be coming from a more public sector leaning organization. With the American with Disabilities Act, we actually have two different titles. Title II, which is focused specifically on state and local government. And actually last week, or just 4 days ago, it was supposed to go into effect according to the DOJ. But because only about 14% of organizations were prepared for that deadline, they've actually decided to move it a year. That doesn't mean, hey, you have a year until you should be accessible. It means you have a year to get this right. Otherwise, there will be some sort of enforcement issues there. And for Title III, that is the part of the ADA that is focused on private businesses, or for considering websites as spaces of public inclusion. So you do need to make those accessible. And we have seen a rise in ADA lawsuits against private businesses over the years. In fact, just in 2025, there were over 5,000 lawsuits. So this isn't just bringing some random legislation to you. This is telling you, hey, there's really an infrastructure of regulations behind this. Someone at your organization needs to start taking ownership around it. Someone needs to start reviewing and preparing for this so that you're put in the best situation forward, not only from the compliance aspect, but also in terms of your brand reputation and what that can yield for your organization. And I believe, Kelley, it's 1 in 4 people in the US, or 1 in 4 adults in the US has a disability. But an organization called the Valuable 500 found that the purchasing power of that community of people with disabilities is 8 trillion. And when you think also of friends, family, community of people with disabilities, that purchasing power or that pool of money then becomes $13 trillion. And that's a market that
Right.
you should be tapping into. It makes sense numerically.
Yeah, there's definitely the level of like brand loyalty. And if you think about it, it makes sense. For me, as a wheelchair user, if I can go to a restaurant that has a stair-free entry, that has a bathroom that I get into, it allows me to have a nice experience with my family eating dinner, and I'm likely going to go back. The same holds true in the digital space. If you can log on, if you can accomplish the goals, you can click where you want to click, you know how to check, you can get to checkout, you can make that transaction, you're going to return to that space over and over again.
Agreed. I think the same thing for everyone, and it doesn't have to be just for people with disabilities, but even more so in that community. So we know that we said that UNRRA, the UNRRA Act in California, has a $4,000 cost per violation of accessibility barriers. We haven't necessarily seen these numbers. I'll explain in a moment because we do have some examples to share with you of settlements that have happened. But if you were to think about the fact that $4,000 per violation and the WebAIM research that I mentioned earlier that has scanned 1 million websites and found that the average number of accessibility errors per page is about 56.1. So let's say if you had around 56 errors per page times $4,000 per violation, that's about $250,000 even just for your home page before you've even thought of the cost of legal fees, of actually remediating those issues. So you're seeing here now in real time what this could look like if you don't address those accessibility barriers. Kelley, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, having to go and fix things after the fact is always going to create a much more expensive environment. You can, a lot of people are like, well, I'll worry about it when I need to worry about it. And one, having accessible website is like the right thing to do. We've already talked about why it's a good business decision, but also it's going to eliminate like a substantial financial risk. Because if you start running those numbers and you get into the six figures very quickly, and that doesn't account for attorney's fees and litigation costs and all the other components of a legal action, it just escalates at such a quick level, and it takes you and distracts you from building your business.
And originally, who was supposed to be joining you here today for this webinar is Tanya Singer, who's our litigation support manager. And she works with our clients at accessiBe on a regular basis. Those who might have received a demand letter or a lawsuit that come in and say, hey, we need to make our website accessible as soon as possible. And she could possibly speak a little bit more to the stress that follows someone who's in that situation. So to Kelley's point of actually having a proactive approach, you're also going to have, in the US, anyone can sue anyone. But if you have a defensible approach, if you've taken the steps and going back to our quick self-check of who owns this, when was the last time you've done an audit? Have you tested it yourself just to make sure that it works? Those small components, each of those small steps builds up. So Kelley was saying it, and I agree with her, it's going to be a lot more expensive to handle this after the fact. But we're assuming also that most of you here today already have an existing website. So how do you sort of balance those two things of starting from the beginning, but also now playing catch up? And I think a big part of that is start with your first step. Check a specific flow on your website, test only one page, make sure that you know who is responsible for that page and making those adjustments so that you can slowly build that into a broader program and actually start resolving some broader scale issues. And we have solutions for that as well, but we'll get there when we get there. So I know this number may seem scary. We do have two cases that we want to bring to you today, just to give you a little bit of context of what has been happening in the California market. And then we'll go into a little bit more about what you can do next. So The first case that we'll share with you is Bashan versus Reserve California. This was a camping website. A blind camping enthusiast wanted to go and reserve some time for them, for some time for a weekend away. Was unable to do that with the website and sued the platform. Eventually, the platform that created that website settled for $2 million. Under the UNRRA and False Claims Act, and saying that they were accessible when they in fact were not. So, Kelley, any thoughts about this sort of case?
Yeah, and I mean, in this case, kind of illustrates what we were talking about, that crossover on like things that touch our state and local or federal governments, and being able to manage a website that is to access you know state public lands. The courts are going to take that very seriously, and many of the states now are implementing additional pieces of legislation to require the states, require businesses who are operating on behalf of the states to be accessible. And the judges are not going to look favorably at all in situations where there has been a lot of ability, a lot of time given to make these corrections, and they're still not done. This type of number, when you're getting into a $2 million settlement, a lot of that accounts for attorneys' cost and fees, to be honest, but it just shows how much work attorneys have to do to litigate these issues, and ultimately it falls back on the owners of the business.
I'll say one that you phrase that perfectly, but I'll say one more thing to that I just realized. It's the web developer behind the California State's Park Reservation platform, meaning, and this actually connects back to ADA Title II, that vendors are expected also to be accessible. So we're going to be seeing that more and more, that if you are applying for an RFP, or if you want to be a contractor to a specific organization, you can expect to be asked about your level of accessibility as well. Okay.
That's right. I mean, the courts are not going to care. They're just going to care if the spaces that are made for the state of California are accessible, and it doesn't really matter. Like, all those layers behind it have to fall in line.
Mhm. Okay, now let's get into what I think is maybe my favorite case ever, because it's complicated but also so easily understood. So, Fashion Nova is a large e-commerce website based in California. They were sued as part of a class action lawsuit for not having an accessible website, and settled for $5.15 million with a commitment to making their website accessible. This is back in 2024. Just recently, the DOJ dismissed that settlement for two reasons. One, because the website had not properly made the efforts to actually implement accessibility into their website, meaning they still had the same issues on their website. And two is that the website that they had for settlements, meaning because it was a class action, people could apply for the settlement fee, that website was not accessible either. So almost a double whammy of inaccessibility. Kelley, what are your thoughts on that?
There's a couple of things here. First, let's put this in context. This case is what's called a class action. That means an individual, in this case, Alcazar, brought a claim against Fashion Nova, representing the interest of many, many, many people. That's why you're going to see a larger number, because if a case involves 1,000 people, 1,500 people, 20,000 people, those numbers are going to, for what a settlement will take, will go up substantially. So in this case, it was considered a class action. The second interesting thing is, like, when Sapir was saying that the Department of Justice was involved, like, this case was filed in court, was going on its own path. The Department of Justice inserted itself into this. It filed a statement of interest, and that meant that not only was the court looking at this, but the Department of Justice had its eyes on this kind of case and what was happening in it. And so there was that additional layer of scrutiny over what was going on to ensure that this class action was being set in a way that really resolved the issues that existed, that it wasn't just being like, here's the payoff, now let us go on. No, the government wanted to make sure that this settlement also represented a clear change in accessibility for the website.
And a good thing to add here, or maybe something that you might be asking yourself as a guest to this webinar is, okay, well, you're sharing this state platform, you're sharing this large e-commerce website that has nothing to do with my business here and today. But this is the direction that the internet is going in. There's an expectation around website accessibility and putting your best effort forward. And we've seen that settlements do typically reside in the round, let's say $15,000 to $20,000. That's still not a cost that you want to have to pay. And taking those initial steps or making sure that your website is accessible will help you make sure that you're prepared for the future of your digital business. So
Yeah,
Mhm.
and just one thing to add, like, I mean, the Department of Justice, when they came and stated in the early 2020s that websites have to be accessible, they didn't say if they didn't add if you have so many employees, if your website has so many pages. It didn't contemplate those types of things. It simply said that sites need to be accessible. That means exposure can exist from very small companies all the way up to the very largest.
Mm-hmm. And I've been in calls with customers that say, well, people with disabilities aren't shopping on my website, which that just can't be true because one, you don't have that information. And two, because as we said before, one in four people or one in four adults in the US has a disability. So making these adjustments and making remediations on your website to be more accessible is actually improving usability for everyone. So one thing that we mentioned before is that California is historically in the top 3 states for ADA lawsuits. It does follow New York and Florida, but we are seeing this trend upwards across the entire United States. So just in case you are not a California-based person, but you are part of this conversation here today, we do want to make sure that you're aware. Some of the more common accessibility issues that we might find on websites, and this is sort of to help you review where you can start testing those user flows or making some plans around them, is navigation and menus. So if you have a menu on your website, if you need to test specific user flows, how can you do that? Let's say if you're not using a mouse, if you're using another kind of assistive technology, can you navigate the entire website with just your keyboard to make sure that you can reach every single element? So in the event that, for example, I want to complete a purchase of a shirt, but I can't reach with my keyboard, the checkout button, that website essentially becomes inaccessible to me, and I will most likely not be purchasing my shirt from that business. Next is forms and checkouts. So similarly, wanting to leave my information, being able to go from tab to tab to be able to add my information and properly purchase. Images without alt text. So this is one that usually scares a lot of people. But in the event that you have a website that has a lot of images, whether you're showing a lot of different products, or maybe you're showing your team members, or also showing views of California, you want to be able to add that information for those who are using screen readers. They will primarily be blind users, although not always. And alt text will help with making sure that they get the same level of description that someone else would be able to see visibly on the website. Two other aspects about alt text is that it also improves usability and search indexing. So when someone is looking for information, it'll help with SEO as well. And next, we have buttons and links without clear labels. So I've definitely seen this happen on users with disabilities web experiences where they're trying to navigate, but buttons aren't properly coded. So it'll just say link, link, link instead of what the button actually is and what its functionality is. And so they won't be able either to use it or understand where it will take them. Another thing that I've been guilty of when I managed a website in a previous life was adding buttons to a website, and I wrote click here. And this is actually maybe one of my favorite fun facts about accessibility, but click here is not a good CTA for your buttons, because a person with a disability who either cannot see the website or just needs that additional context will not know where that button leads them. So always lead with simplicity and making sure that it's very obvious where people are going on your website, and make it as easy and intuitive for them to be able to use your website. And then finally, another common accessibility issue that we see is pop-ups and any sort of dynamic content. If those come up on a website and a user isn't able to very easily X out of those. I know that for a lot of people, if you go to a website and all of a sudden you get like 10 different ads of get 15% off, and you're like, that's great, but I just want to see what's on the website. It can be a very frustrating experience. But if you're a user of assistive technology and you're unable to exit out of those pop-up windows or be able to actually navigate the resources that you want to navigate, it can be an even more frustrating and sort of trapped experience. So those are some quick sort of examples of common accessibility issues you might find on your website, and things that you can already look for when you're starting to navigate your web today. And I'll click to the next slide. So this slide is more for you, Kelley, about how do accessibility issues, sort of the examples that I've shared before, how do those actually become lawsuits, or when does that sort of happen?
Yeah, you can kind of break it down into different sections. First being there's an issue. Accessibility barriers are common across most every website. Even, we make our best efforts, but without ongoing audits, without a system in place, without those checks and balances, accessibility barriers can very easily exist. And if they go unnoticed internally within the business, that doesn't mean they're going to go unnoticed by the public. It's actually quite the opposite. When there's a long-standing issue and it's causing people over and over to not be able to navigate pages in the way they need to, like, that's going to be a very easily identifiable red flag for accessibility. So then, that's when the person there's no systems in place, the barriers exist, so then people are using it and they encounter a barrier. Sometimes people may try again. Sometimes people might just be, frustrated with a system where they're trying to go from site to site and nowhere's working, and they might want to do something about it. And when they do that, that's called a demand letter. A demand letter lays out what a person's experience was in accessing your site, how it does not align with the legal requirements under WCAG or other, accessibility guidelines. And then it's going to say why, under the law, you are not in compliance, and demand that not only the website get fixed, but some type of monetary payment as a result of that issue. You know, when you get a demand letter, when that pops into your office, what happens? What are you going to do? Usually it's not a calm situation. It's people who are not prepared for this, and it causes kind of that chaos of what's broken, who's responsible, what are we supposed to do. You don't really know what's going on. It's unclear how many pages, where everything exists, and then your priorities have to shift, because then you're having to go and you're certainly on the defense at that side at that time. So then you have to decide as a company, how are we going to fix the issue? How are we going to respond? What is it going to take to either fight the issue or make it go away or resolve the issue? How you remediate your site if you decide to settle. And usually this is not something where you're given unlimited time to respond. You're going to be given weeks, a month, to be able to come back with your position, have a response to what's going on. And all of this, during this, once once you're at step 2, 3, 4, what is all this? It's time away from building your business, building your brands, and it's focusing on things that could have really been dealt with, on the front end, and instead of having to be in that scramble mode, knowing that there's going to be a financial cost to make this go away.
That's why your investment in this webinar today is actually the gift of knowledge to help you prepare for that future situation. If that event happens, we don't want it to happen, but if that event happens, then you'll already have the steps to be accessible. You'll already have started your plan to have a more effective website, a more usable website, and one that has a better, that brings in better business because it works for everyone. Thank you, Kelley, for breaking that down. That was really helpful. And I also invite everyone here, if you have any questions, to add them in the chat or the Q&A box as we're gearing towards the end of the webinar. And I want to make sure that we answer your questions before we end today. So we'll just touch on some key takeaways from the conversation. And Kelley, I'd love your help here. But essentially, my understanding from all of this and having been in this space for a while is accessibility risk is real. And it's not only ongoing, but it's growing, meaning there's more awareness and it's becoming more complicated for websites to actually be accessible, even though the solutions are out there to make them, to be able to identify and remediate them. And then having a proactive approach to that puts you basically miles ahead.
Yeah, and I think where we are now in 2026 is there have been, if you looked back 10, 15 years ago, there would be like a handful of web accessibility cases that were coming into legal dockets. Where we are in this moment is those numbers are very high. And what it also means is that a lot of these cases have worked through. So the disability community knows that the law is on their side. They don't have to be in fear of filing to whether they can succeed, oftentimes because there's enough cases, enough precedent out there to suggest that websites need to be accessible. And if they are not, then a plaintiff or a claimant has the ability to have success in making a business change their website.
Thank you for that, Kelley. So as we're gearing towards the end of the webinar and this conversation, you're wondering, okay, what you walked through some steps before of what we should be checking, but what are some things that we can actually do to be more effective? So with accessibility, with websites, you want to test what's breaking. And that means you can go in yourself and see where are you having issues on your website? Because if you're having an issue on your website, that probably is true for others as well. And if these are repeatable issues, if these are something that you can see happening across multiple pages or happening across multiple experiences and flows, see if that's something you can also automate, meaning where can you actually solve this issue across the board rather than having to approach each item on its own. And then once you've made those changes, you also need to have some sort of cadence of making sure that you're coming back to it and documenting that. Documentation is coming up as one of those pieces that's really important these days, because you can be making these efforts, but you also want to show the progress that you've been making over time. And I think a lot of accessibility, and this might be a personal opinion, so Kelley, feel free to chime in, but I think a lot of accessibility is progress over perfection. There's always going to be something more that you can do, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do anything to begin with. What do you think about that? Just to sort of use it as a sounding board to myself.
Yeah, I think that when you're able to work collaboratively within your organization, and know that you don't have to feel alone in this. There's many companies that that's what they do. It doesn't have to be like, for me as a business owner, I was like, this is a very foreign space for me because, I'm a lawyer and I know the law, but I don't really know the technical side of things. And we can't let that kind of fear of not knowing something keep us from doing something that makes a lot of business sense, is better for, the community as a whole. And so I think there's just so many ways now that makes it's a very manageable issue. It doesn't have to overwhelm your business. It's not going to financially overwhelm you. It's not going to personnel overwhelm you. It's very achievable.
And it's part of what every business should be doing today. So you laid it out perfectly for me, Kelley. Thank you for that. With accessiBe, we do have a few different options for you to be able to address website accessibility internally at your business. We do have AI automation for our Access widget. This is the interface that you might be familiar with, where users can come onto the website and make quick select adjustments that will make the website more usable for their particular needs. That also has AI on the back end to support screen reader optimization and keyboard navigation. Specifically for developers, although if you're working with a developer team, you can also work on this by having it send tickets directly to them. But we do have solutions that help them actually identify gaps in accessibility experiences before you've even launched the website, or while you have it on the website. You can basically, you'll have a dashboard that tells you where the accessibility errors exist, and you can either resolve them directly through the platform, you can direct them over to the ticketing system that your team is using, and resolve those issues a lot more quickly directly in the source code. And then finally, we also have expert services. That is things like user testing, remediation of documents like PDFs or video files, if you have those as well. The AI does not touch those because they are not considered part of the HTML if you're adding them to your website. But another thing I want to mention here, and this is for those of you who might be working with public sector organizations or seeking contracts, you may be asked to present a VPAT or an audit of your solution. And those are things that our expert team, our Access Services expert team, will be able to support. So those are a few different ways that our teams can work together. You can reach out to us and we'll have someone from our team also help you navigate exactly what the right fit is for your solution. But essentially our real first step, and I'll add this soon in the chat, is to scan your website. Make sure that you know what's accessible, what's not, what's working for you. Evaluate those results. Speak with someone from our team, and you'll get an accessibility roadmap that really helps you set yourself apart from the direction that this is going in. So with that, Kelley, I'll push a first question to you, and we have a couple in the chat, so I'll get to those right after. But for you, as we're getting to the end of the webinar, what is a key takeaway that you want people to walk away from today's conversation with?
What I would say is that, you know, the risk, it is a real one. We know that because just based on the numbers that we put up there are actually lawsuits that were filed. And so when we went through the 1, 2, 3, 4, really 5 would actually be you didn't resolve it in a settlement and then it's thrown into the courts. But it is real. And but the number underneath that, where those settlements, where those demand letters are taking place, is kind of like where you see the iceberg. You see like the little tip of it over the surface, but what's underneath it is this like massive thing. And that's really those demand letters that can come at any time. But we, if you get ahead of it, you don't have to be in fear of that, letter getting delivered to you. As a lawyer, I will say, like, that process can become a big headache for a business. And so the biggest takeaway is, like, use the tools that can make it very easily achievable to have an accessible site, to invite all communities in to your website, knowing that ultimately, it's what you have to do and it's the right thing to do.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll jump into the questions that we've received from the audience. From Danielle, we have, how can a freelance web designer protect themselves from decisions made by their client? Beyond advising a budget and steps that allow for accessibility, there is no way for a contractor to force company decisions. Is a designer still financially vulnerable in that case? Danielle, that is a great question, and one that we've seen a lot, especially with web agencies and specifically freelancers who are working maybe with smaller clients or who are taking on the responsibility on themselves. So the first step is, you've already learned about website accessibility today. So you have, like I said, the gift of knowledge of bringing this to your customers and explaining to them where the gaps really lie. Yes, you can't force any client decisions, but you can put it into your own project plan or scope of work for your clients and say, hey, these are my recommendations. I need you to know that you have to have an accessible website by law. And make sure that they are aware and that they're signing off that they're not doing an accessible website. I don't know if that's legally the right way to phrase it, but they need to have that awareness. And you, as their web designer, want to reduce the risk upon yourself. Kelley, is that a reasonable
Yeah,
ask?
I mean, I think what we've seen in the past sometimes is freelance or smaller individuals who are contracting, they'll put their recommendations, it'll include that line item for accessibility. And if a company decides for whatever reason not to, that they kind of sign off acknowledging that, that they are not including that, and that kind of puts that layer of separation and protection saying it was offered and you explicitly declined it. So I think for your part, that documentation of it being offered and that they have chose, they made that choice to decline that part of the service in writing, kept in your file.
Great. I have two questions that are sort of similar, so I'm going to be combining them. One is from Tony. As someone currently using accessiBe, is implementing a widget alone sufficient for ADA compliance, or does it need to be paired with manual remediation to provide meaningful legal protection? So that's one part of the question. And we have another question from the accessibility group at Cognella asking, no, sorry, I wanted to read this other question from Michelle. I apologize. Can you clarify how the accessiBe widget, Access widget as we refer to it, helps websites comply, and how does the widget help users access the services provided? What is the responsibility of the website owner to correct or address any issues identified if the widget is correcting the compliance issue? How would a lawyer view sites that are using a widget to comply if they find a compliance issue? So the question really here from these two, the bottom line of these two different questions is the widget doing enough? What is it doing? And do I need to be doing more? And that actually goes also to the third question that we had about doing the bare minimum. So Access widget is the fastest solution that you do have, or that we do have, for maintaining accessibility on your website, because it allows you to already automate the process. It will help users make the adjustments that will help make the website more usable for their experience. And it does adhere to the WCAG 2.2 AA guidelines, which means that it is sufficient for ADA compliance. And we do offer a proof of effort toolkit as well as litigation support for customers. One thing that we have added in based on these conversations, and this is also due to a lot of customer feedback, is making sure that we do have regular reviews of people's websites. So we do have manual testing and custom remediation, meaning that our team of experts will review your website and identify if there are any gaps while the widget is still upon it, and be able to address those with you. Websites change on a very frequent basis. And so making sure that you're not doing just a bare minimum, set it and forget it type solution, but actually have an accessibility program that puts you in the best position, both from a defensibility standpoint and from a brand trust and perception standpoint. And not only trust and perception, but really the usability of your website will set you up for success. So I hope that answers the question for all three different questions, but it really is your best effort. It's all about doing your best effort, your reasonable at best effort. So the first step is, yeah, I would recommend doing a scan of your website, testing a few user flows, making sure that you have a widget there to support it. But we do have other solutions as well to support the source code remediation or any other documentation that you need. That was a mouthful for me, Kelley. Anything that you want to synthesize from that?
No, I think you did a great job like putting that big picture, and really from what I see from the a judge is looking for from the court's perspective is the steps that a business is taking or has taken to remediate an inaccessible site. What are they doing to allow customers to come in? If you know about an issue, like you have a widget, but there's still, and you're aware that an issue exists, like there's, YouTube videos up and there's not captioning or whatever, there something comes up, like, yeah, then you should take those steps, because again, it's going to go back to if you were in front, if you were in court in front of a judge, they're going to look you in the eyes and say, what all did you do? What steps did you take? And I think, everyone's looking for it doesn't have to be everything, but it needs to be reasonable, and it needs to show that that effort was made.
Great points. Thanks, Kelley. And so our last question for today is from Alondra about what PDF audits are conducted by expert services to ensure ADA compliance. So if you're still a business that is using PDFs, whether you're documenting specific processes on your website and adding those, or if you have a newsletter and you're sharing the PDF after on your website, most likely that PDF documentation is not built with accessibility in mind. And there's some simple fixes that you can do, but for a lot of businesses that do have that process, they might have been adding PDFs for a long time. And so remediation would basically be making sure that it's usable for screen reader users, for keyboard navigation, that someone who is using any sort of assistive technology would be able to navigate through those pages. Those would be the highest priority, I think, in terms of the usability of those documentation. But same goes also for font size, readability, color contrast. If someone has to do any sort of process from your website via a PDF and that PDF is not usable for them, then that whole process becomes inaccessible. And that, I think, is the big takeaway regarding not just PDFs, but any process that you have in your digital experience. Those were all the questions for today. We did go a little bit longer than I thought we would, but I'm glad that there was some participation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. We will definitely be following up with the recording and any additional information that you're interested in. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. We appreciate your time today and hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you so much, Kelley, for your time. Really appreciate it.